In the summer of 1940, the jackboot of the Third Reich seemed unstoppable. Paris had fallen. Warsaw was a city of ghosts. Norway and the Netherlands were crushed. From the English Channel to the Soviet border, the swastika flew over a cowed and silent continent. It was, as Hitler proclaimed, the dawn of a thousand-year Reich. But in the darkest shadows of this new order, in cellars and forests, in universities and quiet apartments, the war was not over. It was just beginning. This is the story of the defiant, the men and women who, with no armies, no air force, and no hope of conventional victory, chose to fight back. They were students, priests, housewives, factory workers, and disillusioned soldiers. They were spies, saboteurs, and poets. They were the resistance, and their courage would prove that the human spirit cannot be occupied. To resist in Nazi-occupied Europe was not a simple choice. It was a daily sentence of death. It meant trusting your life to a whisper, a coded phrase, a hidden compartment. The price for being caught was not a fair trial. It was the interrogation room of the Gestapo. It was the Nacht und Nebel, the night and fog decree, where suspected resistors vanished without a trace, their families never knowing if they were alive or dead. And the reprisals were savage. For one German soldier killed, 100 civilians might be executed. Whole villages, like Oradour-sur-Glane in France or Lidai in Czechoslovakia, were erased from the map, their populations murdered in cold blood as a lesson. To resist was to risk not only your own life, but the lives of everyone you loved. And yet, they did. Perhaps the most dangerous place on earth to defy Hitler was not in occupied Paris or Warsaw, but in Germany itself. Here the state was not an occupying force. It was, in the eyes of many, the legitimate government. The scent was not just rebellion, it was treason. In 1942, at the University of Munich, a handful of students and their professor decided they could no longer be silent. They called themselves the White Rose. Their leaders were siblings, Hans and Sophie Scholl, medical students who had witnessed the regime's atrocities on the Eastern Front. Their weapons were not bombs, they were words. Using a secret duplicating machine, they published a series of leaflets. They quoted forbidden literature, Schiller, Goethe, and they spoke the truth in plain, devastating terms. "We will not be silent," one leaflet read. "We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." They mailed the leaflets to random addresses, left them in phone booths, and carried them in suitcases on trains to other cities. It was an act of breathtaking bravery. For months, the Gestapo hunted them, infuriated by this intellectual ghost. Their end came on February 18, 1943. Hans and Sophie Scholl carried a suitcase of their 6th leaflet into the main university building. They scattered them in the empty halls. As classes let out, Sophie, in a final act of defiance, climbed to the top floor and flung the remaining hundreds of leaflets down into the central atrium, fluttering like snow onto the students below. A janitor saw them and locked the doors. The Gestapo was called. Within 4 days, Sophie, Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were tried by the infamous People's Court. The judge screamed at them, but Sophie Scholl was unmoved. "Somebody, after all, had to make a start," she told the court. "What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did." Hours later, they were executed by guillotine. Sophie was 21 years old. Her final words were, "The sun still shines." While the White Rose fought with ideas, another group of Germans plotted to fight with steel. Within the Wehrmacht itself, a circle of high-ranking officers had come to believe that Hitler was driving Germany to annihilation. They were patriots in their own minds, but traitors in the eyes of the Reich. Their most famous attempt is known as the July 20th plot. The plan was Operation Valkyrie, ironically an existing military plan to deploy the reserve army in case of an internal breakdown of control. The conspirators, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, intended to assassinate Hitler, seize control of Berlin with the reserve army, and negotiate a peace with the Allies. Stauffenberg himself, a war hero who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left, was the one who would carry the bomb. On July 20th, 1944, he flew to Hitler's heavily guarded Wolf's Lair headquarters in Prussia. He managed to place the briefcase, armed with a chemical fuse, under the massive oak map table just feet from where Hitler was standing. He made his excuse and left the room. At 12:42 p.m., a blast tore the conference hut apart. Stauffenberg, seeing the explosion, was convinced Hitler was dead. He bluffed his way past the checkpoints and flew back to Berlin to initiate the coup. But a fatal twist of fate had saved the dictator. Someone had moved the heavy briefcase to the other side of the massive oak table leg just moments before the detonation. Hitler was shielded from the worst of the blast. He was injured, his eardrums shattered, but he was alive. When news of his survival reached Berlin, the Valkyrie coup, which had begun to seize key buildings, fell apart. The retribution was horrific. Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were arrested and shot that very night. In the coming weeks, over 7,000 people were arrested by the Gestapo. Nearly 5,000 were executed. The resistance from within the German military was, for all intents and purposes, broken. While resistance in Germany was a lonely, desperate act, in occupied France, it became a national, if fragmented, shadow war. The resistance was not one group, but a complex web of different cells. They were Gaullists loyal to General de Gaulle in London, communist groups, socialist groups, and the Maquis, young men who had fled to the hills and forests to avoid being drafted into forced labor in Germany. They started small. They published underground newspapers, whispering the truth of the war when all official channels spoke only of collaboration. They created escape lines, guiding downed Allied airmen south over the Pyrenees Mountains to safety in Spain. But their most vital work was sabotage and intelligence. They became the eyes and ears of the Allies. They relayed detailed information on German troop movements, coastal defenses, and fortifications. As D-Day approached, their work became critical. Eisenhower himself would later state that the work of the French resistance was worth 15 divisions of soldiers. But this unity was hard-won. The various groups were often suspicious of each other. The Allies needed a single leader to coordinate them. The man for the job was Jean Moulin. Moulin was a former prefect, a high-ranking civil servant who had been arrested and tortured by the Gestapo in 1940 for refusing to sign a false document blaming Senegalese soldiers for civilian deaths. He tried to take his own life rather than comply, leaving a note that said, "I cannot be an accomplice." He survived and made his way to London to meet de Gaulle. In January 1942, under the codename Rex, Moulin parachuted back into the blackness of occupied France. His mission, to unite all the disparate resistance factions under the leadership of de Gaulle. For 18 months, he moved in the shadows, a man with 1,000 identities, holding secret meetings in apartments and churches, convincing bitter rivals to work together. He succeeded. In May 1943, he presided over the first meeting of the unified National Council of the Resistance. But just 1 month later, he was betrayed. He was arrested in a Lyon suburb by the infamous Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Moulin was tortured for weeks. He was beaten into a coma, his bones broken, but he never spoke. He never gave up the names of his comrades. He never broke the secrets of the organization he had bled to build. He died on a train bound for Germany, his identity still a mystery to his captors. Jean Moulin became the martyr and the symbol of the French resistance. A man who, as André Malraux said, carried the night of France in him. If France's resistance was a web, Poland's was a fortress. No nation suffered more under the Nazi occupation, and no nation fought back with such organized, desperate fury. Within weeks of their defeat in 1939, the Poles had created something unique in history, the Polskie Państwo Podziemne, the Polish underground state. This was not just a handful of partisans. It was a complete, functioning shadow government. It had its own parliament, its own courts of justice that sentenced collaborators to death, its own postal service, and incredibly, its own secret education system. When the Nazis banned all but the most basic schooling, the underground state organized secret classes for over 1 million children, from elementary to university level, ensuring that even if the nation was destroyed, the idea of Poland would survive. The military arm of this state was the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army. At its peak, it numbered nearly 400,000 members. It was the largest and most sophisticated resistance movement in the war. They derailed over 7,000 trains, assassinated key Nazi officials like the SS General Franz Kuchera, and provided the Allies with crucial intelligence, including reports on the V-2 rocket program from Peenemünde. But their story is one of imaginable heroism and ultimate tragedy. In the summer of 1944, with the Soviet Red Army pushing the Germans back and approaching the Vistula River, the Home Army saw its moment. They launched Warsaw Uprising. On August 1, 1944, at 5 p.m. WWII, the city of Warsaw rose up. 40,000 poorly armed fighters, many with only pistols or homemade grenades, attacked the fortified German garrison. Their goal was to liberate their own capital before the Soviets liberated it for them, securing Polish sovereignty. For 18 months, they fought from apartment to apartment, in the sewers, and from behind barricades of overturned trams. But the help they expected never came. Across the river, the Soviet Red Army stopped its advance. Stalin watched, stone-faced, as the Nazis systematically dismantled the Home Army, the very force that might have resisted a post-war Soviet takeover. The Western Allies, unable to convince Stalin to allow them use of air bases, could only make a few costly airdrops of supplies. The Germans, freed from the pressure on the Eastern Front, brought in their heaviest artillery and SS divisions. They went block by block, leveling the city. The uprising was crushed. Over 150,000 civilians were killed. After the surrender, in a final act of calculated spite, Hitler ordered the rest of the city to be dynamited, building by building, until Warsaw was nothing but a sea of rubble. Sometimes resistance wasn't a mass uprising, but a single surgical strike that could alter the entire course of the war. In the remote, frozen mountains of Norway, a battle was being fought over something few even understood: heavy water. At the Vemork hydroelectric plant near the town of Rayukin, the Nazis had taken control of the world's only commercial production site for heavy water, a key component in the German race to build an atomic bomb. The Allies knew they had to stop it, but the plant was a fortress, built on the edge of a sheer 600-foot gorge. After a failed British commando raid, the mission fell to a small team of Norwegian operatives, trained in Britain by the Special Operations Executive. These were men who had fled their homeland, skiing to Sweden, and were now being asked to parachute back in. In February 1943, Operation Gunnerside was launched. A team of 6 saboteurs joined a small advance party that had been surviving for months on the desolate plateau, eating moss and reindeer. Together, the team skied across the frozen wilderness, descended the sheer gorge in the dead of night, and crossed a frozen river. They infiltrated the plant by following a narrow railway line, cutting through a gate with wire cutters. Inside, they located the heavy water chambers. They quietly set their explosive charges, lit the time fuses, and slipped back out into the night. As they began their climb back up the gorge, they heard the dull thud of the explosion. It was, as one commando said, not much louder than a car door slamming. But it had been enough. The blast had ruptured the cells, spilling months of production, over 1,000 pounds of heavy water, down the drains. The German guards, confused, searched the high ground, never believing anyone could have come from the gorge below. When the Germans tried to ship the remaining stockpile to Germany, the same Norwegian resistance team struck again, sinking the ferry Hydro in the deep waters of Lake Tin, sending the last of the heavy water and the Nazi nuclear program to the bottom. It was a mission of impossible odds, executed with breathtaking precision, that may have saved the world from a nuclear-armed Third Reich. From the partisans of Yugoslavia under Tito, who tied down over 30 German divisions, to the Dutch citizens who went on strike to protest the persecution of their Jewish neighbors. From the Greek Endartes in the mountains to the priests and nuns who hid children in convents, the tapestry of resistance was vast and varied. Their legacy is not of simple victory. Many were caught. Many were killed. Their actions often led to horrific reprisals. The Warsaw Uprising was a military catastrophe. The July 20th plot was a bloody failure. But the resistance fighters who defied Hitler did something more than just derail trains or print pamphlets. They waged the war for the soul of their continent. They proved that even under the most total, brutal, and terrifying regime in modern history, there would always be those who could not be silenced. They kept hope alive in a world that had none. They provided vital intelligence that shortened the war and saved countless lives. And they reclaimed the honor of nations that had been forced to collaborate. When the war ended, it was not just the Allied armies who were the liberators. It was these men and women who had fought from the inside who could finally step out of the shadows and into the sun that, as Sophie Scholl knew, was still shining.